a Roman general, a fasting army, and a battlefield soaked in blood. What happens when diplomacy fails? Terrain deceives, and an empire sends its soldiers to fight hungry, tired, and outmaneuvered. This isn't just a story about Rome vs. Persia. It's a story of betrayal by nature, miscalculation in command, and a brutal lesson in military pride. Today, we go back 1,500 years to a forgotten battlefield along the Euphrates, where Roman legions met Persian cavalry in a clash that changed the course of imperial ambition. What really went wrong at the Battle of Callinicus, and why did one of Rome's greatest generals, Belisarius, risk everything on an empty stomach? The Roman Emperor Arcadius had a problem. The Persians had taken the city of Callinicus and were threatening to march on Constantinople. So he sent his greatest general, Belisarius, to stop them. But Belisarius had a problem of his own. His troops hadn't been paid in months and were exhausted from campaigning, so on the night before the battle, he made a decision. His men would fast until the battle was over. They would fight the Persians on an empty stomach. The Romans set up camp near the river Callinicus, where they expected the Persians to attack. But the Persians didn't attack that day or the next. Instead, they sent a group of horsemen to scout the Roman camp. When the horsemen approached, the Romans sounded the alarm, and the soldiers who were supposed to be on guard duty ran away. The horsemen rode through the undefended gates and into the camp. They killed many Romans and took prisoners. Then they rode out of the camp and back to the Persian army with their scouts returning. The Persians decided to attack the next morning, and at dawn they charged into the Roman camp. The Romans were caught off guard, and the battle was going badly for the Romans. Then Belisarius arrived with his men. He rallied the troops and led them into battle. The Romans fought bravely, but they were no match for the Persians. In the end, the Romans lost the battle, and Belisarius was forced to retreat. But as he was retreating, he realized that he had made a mistake. He shouldn't have trusted the Persians. They had tricked him. The river that he had thought was a mile wide was only a few feet deep, and the open field that he had thought was a perfect place to set up camp was actually a trap. The Persians had lured his army into a false sense of security so they could attack them when they were exhausted and hungry. Belisarius retreated to a nearby city where he regrouped and prepared to fight the Persians again. He knew that he couldn't win a battle against a well-rested, well-fed enemy, so he decided to starve the Persians instead. He ordered his men to build siege works around the city and cut off the Persian supply of food after a few days. The Persians began to starve, and they surrendered the city. Belisarius had won the war, but it was a hollow victory. He had lost many soldiers, and the campaign had bankrupted the Roman treasury. The emperor was furious, and he blamed Belisarius for the loss. He stripped Belisarius of his rank and his command and exiled him to a monastery. Belisarius spent his last years writing about his campaigns and the mistakes that he had made. He died believing that he had betrayed Rome, but history remembers him as one of the greatest Roman generals of all time. What do you think? Was Belisarius right to trust the Persians? Why do you think he fasted before the battle? And how do you think the battle would have turned out if Belisarius had known that the river was shallow and the field was a trap? For the Persians, led on by many hopes, undertook an expedition against the Romans, and now, with everything lost, they had beaten a hasty retreat, so that if we compelled them against their will to abandon their purpose of withdrawing and to come to battle with us, we should win no advantage whatsoever if we are victorious. For why should one rout a fugitive, while, if we are unfortunate, as may happen, we shall both be deprived of the victory which we now have, not robbed of it by the enemy, but flinging it away ourselves. And also, we shall abandon the land of the emperor to lie open hereafter to the attacks of the enemy without defenders. Moreover, this also is worth your consideration, that God is always accustomed to succor men in dangers which are necessary, not in those which they choose for themselves. And apart from this, it will come about that those who have nowhere to turn will play the part of brave men even against their will, while the obstacles which are to be met by us in entering the engagement are many. For a large number of you have come on foot, and all of us are fasting. I refrain from mentioning that some even now have not arrived. So spoke Belisarius. But the army began to insult him, not in silence, nor with any concealment, but they came shouting into his presence, and called him weak and a destroyer of their zeal. And even some of the officers joined with the soldiers in this offense, thus displaying the extent of their daring. Belisarius, in astonishment at their shamelessness, changed his exhortation, and now seemed to be urging them on against the enemy and drawing them up for battle, saying that he had not known before their eagerness to fight, but that now he was of good courage and would go against the enemy with a better hope. He then formed the phalanx with a single front, disposing his men as follows. On the left wing by the river, he stationed all the infantry, while on the right, where the ground rose sharply, he placed Arethusa and all his Saracens. He himself, with the cavalry, took his position in the center. Thus, the Romans arrayed themselves. And when Azarath saw the enemy gathering in battle line, he exhorted his men with the following words: Persians, as you are, no one would deny that you would not give up your valor in exchange for life if a choice of the two should be offered. But I say that, not even if you should wish, is it within your power to make the choice between the two. For as for men who have the opportunity to escape from danger and live in dishonor, it is not at all unnatural that they should, if they wish, choose what is most pleasant instead of what is best. But for men who are bound to die, either gloriously at the hands of the enemy or shamefully led to punishment by your master, it is extreme folly not to choose what is better instead of what is most shameful. Now, therefore, when things stand thus, I consider that it befits you all to bear in mind not only the enemy, but also your own Lord, and so entered this battle. After Azarath also had uttered these words of exhortation, he stationed the phalanx opposite his opponents, assigning the Persians the right wing and the Saracens the left. Straightway, both sides began the fight, and the battle was exceedingly fierce. The arrows shot from either side in very great numbers caused great loss of life in both armies, while some placed themselves in the interval between the armies and made a display of valorous deeds against each other. And especially among the Persians, they were fallen by the arrows in great numbers. For while their missiles were incomparably more frequent, since the Persians are almost all bowmen, and they learned to make their shots much more rapidly than any other man, still the bows which sent the arrows were weak and not very tightly strung, so that their missiles, hitting a corselet, perhaps, or a helmet or shield of a Roman warrior, were broken off and had no power to hurt the man who was hit. The Roman bowmen are always slower indeed, but inasmuch as their bows are extremely stiff and very tightly strung, and one might add that they are handled by stronger men, they easily slay much greater numbers of those they hit than do the Persians, for no armor proves an obstacle to the force of their arrows. Now, already 2/3 of the day had passed, and the battle was still even. Then, by mutual agreement, all the best of the Persian army advanced to attack the Roman right wing, where Arethusa and the Saracens had been stationed. But they broke their formation and moved apart, so that they got the reputation of having betrayed the Romans to the Persians. For, without awaiting the oncoming enemy, they all straightway beat a hasty retreat. So the Persians in this way broke through the enemy's line and immediately got in the rear of the Roman cavalry. And with him 800 others perished after showing themselves brave men in this struggle. And almost all the Isaurians fell with their leaders, without even daring to lift their weapons against the enemy. For they were thoroughly inexperienced in this business, since they had recently left off farming and entered into the perils of warfare, which before that time were unknown to them. And yet just before, these very men had been most furious of all for battle because of their ignorance of warfare, and were then reproaching Belisarius with cowardice. They were not, in fact, all Isaurians, but the majority of them were Lycaones. Belisarius, with some few men, remained there, and as long as he saw Ascan and his men holding out, he also, in company with those who were with him, held back the enemy. But when some of Ascan's troops had fallen, and the others had turned to flee wherever they could, then at length he too fled with his men and came to the phalanx of infantry, who, with Peter, were still fighting. Although not many in number now, since the most of them too had fled, there he himself gave up his horse and commanded all his men to do the same thing, and on foot with the others to fight off the oncoming enemy, and those of the Persians who were following the fugitives. And again the battle became fierce, although the two sides were not evenly matched in strength. 4 foot soldiers, and a very few of them were fighting against the whole Persian cavalry. Nevertheless, the enemy were not able either to rout them or in any other way to overpower them, for standing shoulder to shoulder, they kept themselves constantly massed in a small space, and they formed with Persians more conveniently than they were shot at by them. Many a time after giving up, the Persians would advance against them, determined to break up and destroy their line. But they always retired again from the assault unsuccessfully, for their horses, annoyed by the clashing of the shields, reared up and made confusion for themselves and their riders. Thus both sides continued the struggle until it had become late in the day. And when night had already come on, the Persians withdrew to their and crossed over to the island in the river, while the other Romans reached the same place by swimming. On the following day, many freight boats were brought to the Romans from the city of Callinicus, and they were conveyed thither in them, and the Persians, after despoiling the dead, all departed homeward. However, they did not find their own. When Azarites reached Persia with his army, although he had prospered in the battle, he found Chabades exceedingly ungrateful for the following reason. It is a custom among the Persians that, when they are about to march against any of their foes, the king sits on the royal throne, and many baskets are set there before him. And a general also is present, who is expected to lead the army against the enemy. Then the army passes along before the king, one man at a time, and each of them throws one weapon into the baskets. After this, they are sealed with the king's seal and preserved. And when this army returns to Persia, each one of the soldiers takes one weapon out of the baskets. Count is then made by those whose office it is to do so of all the weapons which have not been taken by the men. And they report to the king the number of the soldiers who have not returned. And in this way it becomes evident how many have perished in the war. Thus the law has stood from of old among the Persians. Now, when Azarites came into the presence of the king, Chabades inquired of him whether he came back with any Roman fortress. 1. Over to their side, for he had marched forth with Alamandres against the Romans with the purpose of subduing Antioch. Lassae said that he had captured no fortress, but that he had conquered the Romans and Belisarius in battle. So Chabades bade the army of Azarites pass by, and from the baskets each man took out a weapon, just as was customary. But since many weapons were left, Chabades rebuked Azarites for the victory, and thereafter ranked him among the most unworthy. So the victory had this conclusion for assert s. At that time, the idea occurred to the Emperor Justinian to ally with himself the Ethiopians and the Homeritae in order to injure but to occupy. And then I shall point out in what manner the emperor hoped that they would be of help to the Romans. The boundaries of Palestine extend toward the east to the sea, which is called the Red Sea. Now this sea ends, as I have said, and becomes a very narrow gulf. And as one sails into the sea from there, the Egyptian mountains lie on the right, extending toward the south. On the other side, a country deserted by men extends northward to an indefinite distance, and the land on both sides is visible as one sails in, as far as the island called Iatabe, not less than 1,000 stades distant from the city of Elis. On this island, Hebrews had lived from of old in autonomy, but in the reign of this Justinian, they had become subject to the Romans. From there on, there comes a great open sea. And those who sail into this part of it know longer see the land on the right, but they always anchor along the left coast when night comes on. For it is impossible to navigate in the darkness on this sea, since it is everywhere full of shoals. But there are harbors there, in great numbers of them, not made by the hand of man, but by the natural contour of the land. And for this reason, it is not difficult for mariners to find anchorage wherever they happen to be. Saracens, who have been settled from of old in the palm groves. These groves are in the interior, extending over a great tract of land, and there absolutely nothing else grows except palm trees. The Emperor Justinian had received these palm groves as a present from Arcadius, the ruler of the Saracens there, and he was appointed by the emperor captain over the Saracens in Palestine. He guarded the land from plunder constantly, for both of the barbarians over whom he ruled, and no less to the enemy. Arcadius always seemed a man to be feared, and an exceptionally energetic fellow. Formally, therefore, the emperor holds the palm groves, but for him really to possess himself of any of the country, there is utterly impossible. For a land completely destitute of human habitation and extremely dry lies between, extending to the distance of a 10 days' journey. Moreover, the palm groves themselves are by no means worth anything. Arcadius only gave the form of a gift, and the emperor accepted it with full knowledge of the fact. So Saracens in possession of the coast, who were called Medini, and who were subjects of the Homeritae. These Homeritae dwell in the land on the farther side of them on the shore of the sea, and beyond them many other nations are said to be settled as far as the man-eating Saracens. Beyond these are the nations of India. But regarding these matters, let each one out opposite the Homeritae on the opposite mainland dwell the Ethiopians, who are called Oxomite, because their king resides in the city of Oxomes. In the expanse of sea which lies between is crossed in a voyage of 5 days and nights, when a moderately favoring wind blows. For here they are accustomed to navigate by night also, since there are no shoals at all in these parts. This portion of the sea has been called the Red Sea by some, for the sea which one traverses beyond this point, as far as the shore and the city of Hellas, has received the name of the Arabian Gulf, inasmuch as the country which extends from here to the limits of the city of Gaza used to be called in olden times Arabia, since the king of the Arabs had his palace in early times in the city of Petrae. Now the harbor of the Homeritae, from which they are accustomed to put to sea for the voyage to Ethiopia, is called Bulicus, and at the end of the sail across the sea they always put in at the harbor a distance of 20 states, while from the city of Axonis all the boats which are found in India and on this sea are not made in the same manner as our other ships, for neither are they smeared with pitch, nor with any other substance, nor indeed are the planks fastened together by iron nails going through and through, but they are bound together with a kind of cording. The reason is not, as most persons suppose, that there are certain rocks there which draw the iron to themselves, for witness the fact that when the Roman vessels sail from Elis into this sea, although they are fitted with much iron, no such thing has ever happened to them, but rather because the Indians and the Ethiopians possess neither iron nor any other thing suitable for such purposes. Furthermore, they are not even able to buy any of these things from the Romans, since this is explicitly forbidden to all by law. For death is the punishment for one who is caught. Such then is the description of the so-called Red Sea and of the land which lies on either side of it. From the city of Oxomes to the Egyptian boundaries of the Roman domain, where the city called Elephantine is situated, is a journey of 30 days for an unencumbered traveler. Within that space, many nations are settled, and among them the Blemmies and the Nabatea, who are very large nations. But the Blemmies dwell in the central portion of the country, while the Nabatea possess the territory about the river Nile. Formerly, this was not the limit of the Roman Empire, but it lay beyond there as far as one would advance in a 7 days' journey. But the Roman Emperor Diocletian came there and observed that the tribute from these places was of the smallest possible account. Since the land is at that point extremely narrow, for rocks rise to an exceedingly great height at no great distance from the Nile and spread over the rest of the country, while a very large body of soldiers had been stationed there from of old, the maintenance of which was an excessive burden upon the public. And at the same time, the Nabatae, who formerly dwelt about the city of Oasis, used to plunder the whole region. So he persuaded these barbarians to move from their own habitations and to settle along the river Nile, promising to bestow upon them great cities and land both extensive and incomparably better than that which they had previously occupied. For in this way he thought that they would no longer harass the country about Oasis, at least, and that they would possess themselves of the land given them, as being their own, and would probably beat off the Blemies and the other barbarians. And since this pleased the Nabatae, they made the migration immediately, just as Diocletian directed them, and took possession of all the Roman cities and the land on both sides of the river beyond the city of Elephantine. Then it was that this emperor decreed that to them and to the Blemies a fixed sum of gold should be given every year, with the stipulation that they should no longer plunder the land of the Romans. And they received this gold even up to my time, but nonetheless they overrun the country there. Thus it seems that with all barbarians there is no means of compelling them to keep faith with the Romans except through the fear of soldiers to hold them in check. And yet this emperor went so far as to select a certain island in the river Nile close to the city of Elephantine, and there construct a very strong fortress in which he established certain temples and altars for the Romans and these barbarians in common. And he settled priests of both nations in this fortress, thinking that the friendship between them would be secured by reason of their sharing the things sacred to them. And for this reason he named the place Philae. Now both these nations, the Blemies and the Nabatae, believe in all the gods in which the Greeks believe, and they also reverence Isis and Osiris, and, not least of all, Priapus. But the Blemies are accustomed also to sacrifice human beings to the sun. These sanctuaries in Philae were kept by these barbarians even up to my time. But the Emperor Justinian decided to tear them down. Accordingly, Narses, a Persarmenian by birth, whom I had mentioned before as having deserted to the Romans, being commander of the troops there, tore down the sanctuaries at the emperor's order and put the priests under guard and sent the statues to Byzantium. But I shall return to the previous narrative. At about the time of this war, Helistius, the king of the Ethiopians, who was a Christian and the most devoted adherent of this faith, discovered that a number of the Homeritae on the opposite mainland were oppressing the Christians there outrageously. Many of these rascals were Jews, and many of them held in reverence the old faith which men of the present day call Hellenic. He therefore collected a fleet of ships and an army and came against them, and he conquered them in battle and slew both the king and many of the Homeritae. He then set up in his stead a Christian king, a Homerite by birth, by name Izimaphaeus, and after ordaining that he should pay a tribute to the Ethiopians every year, he returned to his home. In this Ethiopian army, many slaves and all who were readily disposed to crime were quite unwilling to follow the king back, but were left behind and remained there because of their desire for the land of the Homeritae part, for it is an extremely goodly land. These fellows, at a time not long after this, in company with certain others, rose against the king Izimaphaeus and put him in confinement in one of the fortresses there, and established another king over the Homeritae, Abramus by name. This Abramus was a Christian, but a slave of a Roman citizen who was engaged in the business of shipping in the city of Agelus in Ethiopia. When Helistius learned this, he was eager to punish Abramus together with those who had revolted with him for their injustice to Izimaphaeus, and he sent against them an army of 3,000 men with one of his relatives as commander. This army, once there, was no longer willing to return home, but they wished to remain where they were in a goodly land. And so, without the knowledge of their commander, they opened negotiations with Abramus. Then, when they came to an engagement with their opponents, just as the fighting began, they killed their commander and joined the ranks of the enemy, and so remained there. But Hellestius was greatly moved with anger and sent still another army against him. His force engaged with Abramus and his men, and, after suffering a severe defeat in the battle, straightway returned home. Thereafter, the king of the Ethiopians became afraid and sent no further expeditions against Abramus. Abramus agreed to pay tribute to the king of the Ethiopians who succeeded him, and in this way he strengthened his rule. But this happened at a later time. At that time, when Hellestius was reigning over the Ethiopians and Ismephius over the Homerite, the Emperor Justinian sent an ambassador, Julianus, demanding that both nations, on account of their community of religion, should make common cause with the Romans in the war against the Persians. For he purposed that the Ethiopians, by purchasing silk from India and selling it among the Romans, might themselves gain much money, while causing the Romans to profit in only one way, namely, that they be no longer compelled to pay over their money to their enemy. This is the silk of which they are accustomed to make the garments which of old the Greeks called metic, but which at the present time they name Syric. As for the Homerite, it was desired that they should establish Cases, the fugitive, as captain over the Medani, and with a great army of their own people and of the maddened Saracens, make an invasion into the land of the Persians. This Cases was by birth of the captain's rank and an exceptionally able warrior. But he had killed one of the relatives of Ismephius and was a fugitive in a land which is utterly destitute of human habitation. So each king, promising to put this demand into effect, dismissed the ambassador, but neither one of them did the things agreed upon by them, for it was impossible for the Ethiopians to buy silk from the Indians, for the Persian merchants always locate themselves at the very harbors where the Indian ships first put in, and are accustomed to by the whole cargoes. And it seemed to the Homerite a difficult thing to cross a country, which was a desert, and which extended so far that a long time was required for the journey across it, and then to go against a people much more warlike than themselves. Later on Abramus too, when at length he had established his power most securely, promised the Emperor Justinian many times to invade the land of Persia, but only once began the journey, and then straightway turned back. Such then were the relations which the Romans had with the Ethiopians and the Homerite. Hermagans, soon as the battle on the Euphrates had taken place, came before Cobades to negotiate with him, but he accomplished nothing regarding the peace on account of which he had come, since he found him still swelling with rage against the Romans. For this reason, he returned unsuccessful. And Belisarius came to Byzantium at the summons of the emperor, having been removed from the office which he held, in order that he might march against the Vandals. But Citus, as had been decreed by the Emperor Justinian, went to the east in order to guard that portion of the empire. And the Persians once more invaded Mesopotamia with a great army under command of Chanaranges and Aspibidus and Murmeros. Since no one dared to engage with them, they made camp and began the siege of Martyropolis, where Baucis and Bessus had been stationed in command of the garrison. This city lies in a land called Sephani, 240 stades distant from the city of Amida toward the north. It is just on the river Nympheus, which divides the land of the Romans and the Persians. So the Persians began to assail the fortifications, and while the besieged at first withstood them manfully, it did not seem likely that they would hold out long. For the circuit wall was quite easily assailable in most parts and could be captured very easily by a Persian siege. And besides, they did not have a sufficient supply of provisions, nor indeed had they engines of war, nor anything else that was of any value for defending themselves. Meanwhile, Citus and the Roman army came to a place called Atachus, 100 stades distant from Martyropolis. But they did not dare to advance further, but established their camp and remained there. Hermogenes also was with them, coming again as ambassador from Byzantium. At this point, the following event took place. It has been customary from ancient times, both among the Romans and the Persians, to maintain spies at public expense. These men are accustomed to go secretly among the enemy in order that they may investigate accurately what is going on, and may then return and report to the rulers. Many of these men, as is natural, exert themselves to act in a spirit of loyalty to their nation, while some also betrayed their secrets to the enemy. At that time, a certain spy who had been sent from the Persians to the Romans came into the presence of the Emperor Justinian and revealed many things which were taking place among the barbarians, and, in particular, that the nation of the Massagetae, in order to injure the Romans, were on the very point of going out into the land of Persia, and that, from there, they were prepared to march into the territory of the Romans and unite with the Persian army. When the emperor heard this, having already a proof of the man's truthfulness to him, he presented him with a handsome sum of money and persuaded him to go to the Persian army, which was besieging the Martyropolitans, and announced to the barbarians there that these Massagetae had been won over with money by the Roman emperor and were about to come against him. That very moment, the spy carried out these instructions, and, coming to the army of the barbarians, he announced to Chosroes and the others that an army of Huns hostile to them would at no distant time come to the Romans. And when they heard this, they were seized with terror and were at a loss how to deal with the situation. At this juncture, it came about that Perozes became seriously ill, and he called to him one of the Persians who were in closest intimacy with him, Perozes by name, and conversed with him concerning Chosroes and the kingdom, and said he feared the Persians would make a serious attempt to disregard some of the things which had been decided upon by him. But Perozes asked him to leave the declaration of his purpose in writing, and bade him be confident that the Persians would never dare to disregard it. So Perozes set it down plainly that Chosroes should become king over the Persians. The document was written by Perozes himself, and Perozes immediately passed from among men September 13th, 531, and when everything had been performed as prescribed by law in the burial of the king, then Perozes, confident by reason of the law, tried to lay claim to the office, but Perozes stood in his way, asserting that no one ought to assume the royal power by his own initiative, but by vote of the Persian notables. Perozes committed the decision in the matter to the magistrates, supposing that there would be no opposition to him from there. But when all the Persian notables had been gathered together for this purpose and were in session, Perozes read the document and stated the purpose of Perozes regarding Chosroes and all, calling to mind the virtue of Perozes, straightway declared Chosroes king of the Persians. Thus then, Chosroes secured the power. Keats, Sidus, and Hermogenes were in fear concerning the city, since they were utterly unable to defend it in its peril, and they sent certain men to the enemy who came before the generals and spoke as follows: "It has escaped your own notice that you are becoming wrongfully an obstacle to the king of the Persians and to the blessings of peace and to each state. 4 ambassadors sent from the emperor are even now present, in order that they may go to the king of the Persians and there settle the differences and establish a treaty with him. But do you, as quickly as possible, remove from the land of the Romans and permit the ambassadors to act in the manner which will be of advantage to both peoples. For we are ready also to give as hostages men of repute concerning these very things, to prove that they will be actually accomplished at no distant date." Such were the words of the ambassadors of the Romans. It happened also that a messenger came to them from the palace, who brought them word that Perozes had died, and that Chosroes, son of Perozes, had become king over the Persians, and that in this way the situation had become unsettled. And as a result of this, the generals heard the words of the Romans gladly, since they feared also the attack of the Huns, the Romans. Therefore, straightway gave as hostages Martinus and one of the bodyguards of Citus, Synesius by name. So the Persians broke up the siege and made their departure promptly. And the Huns, not long afterward, invaded the land of the Romans. But since they did not find the Persian army there, they made their raid a short one, and then all departed homeward. Straightway, Rufinus and Alexander and Thomas came to act as ambassadors with Hermogenes, and they all came before the Persian king at the river Tigris. And when Chosroes saw them, he released the hostages. Then the ambassadors coaxed Chosroes and spoke many beguiling words, most tractable, correctable, and agreed to establish a peace with them that should be without end for the price of 110 centenaria, on condition that the commander of troops in Mesopotamia should be no longer at Dares, but should spend all his time in Constantina, as was customary in former times. But the fortresses in Lazica he refused to give back, although he himself demanded that he should receive back from the Romans both Perangium and the fortress of Bolum. Now the centenarium weighs 100 pounds, for which reason it is so called, for the Romans call 100 centum. He demanded that this gold be given him, in order that the Romans might not be compelled either to tear down the city of Dares or to share the garrison at the Caspian gates with the Persians. However, the ambassadors, while approving the rest, said that they were not able to concede the fortresses unless they should first make inquiry of the emperor concerning them. It was decided, accordingly, that Rufinus should be sent concerning them to Byzantium, and that the others should wait until he should return. And it was arranged with Rufinus that 70 days' time be allowed until he should arrive. When Rufinus reached Byzantium and reported to the emperor what Chosroes' decision was concerning the peace, the emperor commanded that the peace be concluded by them on these terms. In the meantime, however, a report, which was not true, reached Persia, saying that the Emperor Justinian had become enraged and put Rufinus to death. Chosroes, indeed, was much perturbed by this, and already filled with anger, he advanced against the Romans with his whole army. Rufinus met him on the way as he was returning not far from the city of Nisibis. Therefore they proceeded to this city themselves, and since they were about to establish the peace, the ambassadors began to convey the money thither. But the Emperor Justinian was already repenting that he had given up the strongholds of Lazica, and he wrote a letter to the ambassadors expressly commanding them by no means to hand them over to the Persians. For this reason, Chosroes no longer saw fit to make the treaty. And then it came to the mind of Rufinus that he had counseled more speedily than safely in bringing the money into the land of Persia. Straightway, therefore, he threw himself on the earth, and lying prone, he entreated Chosroes to send the money back with them and not march immediately against the Romans, but to put off the war to some other time. And Chosroes bade him rise from the ground, promising that he would grant all these things. So the ambassadors with the money came to Dares, and the Persian army marched back. Then, indeed, the fellow ambassadors of Rufinus began to regard him with extreme suspicion themselves, and they also denounced him to the emperor, basing their judgment on the fact that Chosroes had been persuaded to concede him everything which he asked of him. However, the emperor showed him no disfavor on account of this. At a time not long after this, Rufinus himself and Hermogenes were again sent to the court of Chosroes, and they immediately came to agreement with each other concerning the treaty, subject to the condition that both sides should give back all the places which each nation had wrested from the other in that war, and that there should no longer be any military post in Dares. As for the Iberians, it was agreed that the decision rested with them whether they should remain there in Byzantium or return to their own fatherland. And there were many who remained, and many also who returned to their ancestral homes. 532 AD. Thus then, they concluded the so-called endless peace. When the Emperor Justinian was already in the 6th year of his reign. Okay? And the Romans gave the Persians Byzantium and the fortress of Bolam, together with the money. Okay? And the Persians gave the Romans the strongholds of Lazica. Okay? The Persians also returned Dagaris to the Romans, and received in return for him another man of no mean station. This Dagaris in later times often conquered the Huns in battle, when they had invaded the land of the Romans and drove them out, for he was an exceptionally able warrior. Thus, both sides, in the manner described, made secure the treaty between them. Straightway. It came about that plots were formed against both rulers by their subjects, and I shall now explain how this happened. Chosroes, the son of Arcadius, was a man of an unruly turn of mind and strangely fond of innovations. For this reason, he himself was always full of excitement and alarms, and he was an unfailing cause of similar feelings in all others. All, therefore, who were men of action among the Persians, in vexation at his administration, were purposing to establish over themselves another king from the house of Arcadius. Okay? And since they longed earnestly for the rule of Zames, which was made impossible by the law by reason of the disfigurement of his eye, as has been stated, okay, they found upon consideration that the best course for them was to establish in power his child Arcadius, who bore the same name as his grandfather, while Zames, as guardian of the child, should administer the affairs of the Persians as he wished. So they went to Zames and disclosed their plan, and, urging him on with great enthusiasm, they endeavored to persuade him to undertake the thing. Okay? And since the plan pleased him, they were purposing to assail Chosroes at the fitting moment. But the plan was discovered and came to the knowledge of the king, and thus their proceedings were stopped. For Chosroes slew Zames himself and all his own brothers and those of Zames, together with all their male offspring, and also all the Persian notables who had either begun or taken part in any way in the plot against him. Okay? Among these was Asclepius, the brother of Chosroes' mother. Arcadius, however, the son of Zames, he was quite unable to kill, for he was still being reared under the Chanaranges Adergaddownbades. But he sent a message to the Chanaranges, bidding him himself kill the boy he had reared. For he neither thought it well to show mistrust, nor yet had he power to compel him. The Chanaranges, therefore, upon hearing the commands of Chosroes, was exceedingly grieved, and, lamenting the misfortune, he communicated to his wife and Kabat's nurse all that the king had commanded. Then the woman, bursting into tears and seizing the knees of her husband, entreated him by no means to kill Arcadius. They therefore consulted together and planned to bring up the child in the most secure concealment, and to send word in haste to Chosroes that Arcadius had been put out of the world for him, the king to this effect, and concealed Arcadius in such a way that the affair did not come to the notice of anyone except Varames, their own child, and one of the servants who seemed to them to be in every way most trustworthy. But when, as time went on, Arcadius came of age, the Chanaranges began to fear lest what had been done should be brought to light. He therefore gave Arcadius money and bade him depart and saved himself by flight wherever he could. At that time then, Chosroes and all the others were in ignorance of the fact that the Chanaranges had carried this thing through. At a later time, Chosroes was making an invasion into the land of Caucasus with a great army, as will be told in the following narrative, and he was followed by the son of this same Chanaranges, Varames, who took with him a number of his servants, and among them the one who shared with him the knowledge of what had happened to Arcadius. While there, Varames told the king everything regarding Arcadius, and he brought forward the servant, agreeing with him in every particular. When Chosroes learned this, he was forthwith exceedingly angry, and he counted it a dreadful thing that he had suffered such things at the hand of a man who was his slave. And since he had no other means of getting the man under his hand, he devised the following plan. When he was about to return homeward from the land of Caucasus. He wrote to this Chanoranges that he had decided to invade the land of the Romans with his whole army. Not, however, by a single inroad into the country, but making 2 divisions of the Persian army, in order that the attack might be made upon the enemy on both sides of the river Euphrates. Now, 1 division of the army, he himself, as was natural, would lead into the hostile land, while to no one else of his subjects would he grant the privilege of holding equal honor with the king in this matter, except to the Chanoranges himself on account of his valor. It was necessary, therefore, that the Chanoranges should come speedily to meet him as he returned, in order that he might confer with him and give him all the directions which would be of advantage to the army, and that he should bid his attendants travel behind him on the road. When the Chanoranges received this message, he was overjoyed at the honor shown him by the king, and in complete ignorance of his own evil plight, he immediately carried out the instructions. But in the course of this journey, since he was quite unable to sustain the toil of it, he relaxed his hold on the reins and fell off his horse, breaking the bone in his leg. It was therefore necessary for him to remain there quietly and be cared for, and the king came to that place and saw him. Chosroes said to him that with his leg in such a plight, it was not possible that he make the expedition with them, but that he must go to one of the fortresses in that region and receive treatment there from the physicians. Thus, then Chosroes sent the man away on the road to death, and behind him followed the very men who were to destroy him in the fortress. A man who was, in fact, as well as in name, an invincible general among the Persians, who had marched against 12 nations of barbarians and subjected them all to King Kevitz after Adagonbades had been removed from the world. Varamus, his son, received the office of Chanoranges. Not long after this, either Kebades himself, the son of Zames, or someone else who was assuming the name of Kebades, came to Byzantium. Certainly, he resembled very closely in appearance Kebades the king, and the Emperor Justinian, though in doubt concerning him, received him with great friendliness and honored him as the grandson of Kebades. Then fared the Persians, who rose against Chosroes. Later on, Chosroes destroyed also Mebits for the following reason. While the king was arranging a certain important matter, he directed Soberganes, who was present, to call Mebits. Now, it happened that Soberganes was on hostile terms with Mebits. When he came to him, he found him marshaling the soldiers under his command, and he said that the king summoned him to come as quickly as possible, and Mebits promised that he would follow directly as soon as he should have arranged the matter in hand. But Soberganes, moved by his hostility to him, reported to Chosroes that Mebits did not wish to come at present, claiming to have some business or other. Chosroes, therefore, moved with anger, sent one of his attendants, commanding Mebits to go to the tripod. Now, as to what this is, I shall explain forthwith. An iron tripod stands always before the palace, and whenever any one of the Persians learns that the king is angry with him, it is not right for such a man to flee for refuge to a sanctuary, nor to go elsewhere. But he must seat himself by this tripod and await the verdict of the king, while no one at all dares protect him. There Mebits sat in pitiable plight for many days until he was seized and put to death at the command of Chosroes. Such was the final outcome of his good deeds to Chosroes. At this same time, an insurrection broke out unexpectedly in Byzantium among the populace, and, contrary to expectation, it proved. These colors be brothers or any other kin. They care neither for things divine nor human in comparison with conquering in these struggles. And it matters not whether a sacrilege is committed by anyone at all against God, or whether the laws and the Constitution are violated by friend or by foe. Nay, even when they are perhaps ill supplied with the necessities of life, and when their fatherland is in the most pressing need and suffering unjustly, they pay no heed if only it is likely to go well with their faction. For so they named the bands of partisans, and even women join with them in this unholy strife, and they not only follow the men, but even resist them if opportunity offers. Although they neither go to the public exhibitions at all, nor are they impelled by any other cause. So that I, for my part, am unable to call this anything except a disease of the soul. This, then, is pretty well how matters stand among the people of each and every city. But at this time, the officers of the city administration in Byzantium were leading away to death some of the rioters, with the members of the two factions conspiring together and declaring a truce with each other, seized the prisoners, and then straightway entered the prison and released all those who were in confinement there, whether they had been condemned on a charge of stirring up sedition or for any other unlawful act. And all the attendants in the service of the city government were killed indiscriminately. Meanwhile, all of the citizens who were sand-minded were fleeing to the opposite mainland, and fire was applied to the city as if it had fallen under the hand of an enemy, the sanctuary of Sophia and the baths of Zeuxippus, and a portion of the imperial residence from the Propylaea as far as the so-called house of Ares were destroyed by fire. And besides these, both the great colonnades, which extended as far as the marketplace which bears the name of Constantine, in addition to many houses of wealthy men and a vast amount of treasure. During this time, the emperor and his consort, with a few these, too, poorly enough, but by his natural ability, he became the most powerful man of whom we know. For he was most capable in deciding upon what was needful and in finding a solution for difficulties. But he became the basest of all men and employed his natural power to further his low designs. Neither consideration for God nor any shame before man entered into his mind, but to destroy the lives of many men for the sake of gain and to wreck whole cities was his constant concern. So, within a short time indeed, he had acquired vast sums of money, and he flung himself completely into the sordid life of a drunken scoundrel. For up to the time of lunch, each day, he would plunder the property of his subjects, and for the rest of the day, occupy himself with drinking and with wanton deeds of lust. And he was utterly unable to control himself, for he ate food until he vomited, and he was always ready to steal money and more ready to bring it out and spend it. Such a man, then, was John. Tribunianus, on the other hand, both possessed natural ability and in educational attainments was inferior to none of his contemporaries, but he was extraordinarily fond of the pursuit of money and always ready to sell justice for gain. Therefore, every day, as a rule, he was repealing some laws and proposing others, selling off to those who requested it either favor according to their need. Now, as long as the people were waging this war with each other in behalf of the names of the colors, no attention was paid to the offenses of these men against the Constitution. But when the factions came to a mutual understanding, as has been said, and so began the seditions, then openly throughout the whole city they began to abuse the two and went about seeking them to kill. Accordingly, the emperor, wishing to win the people to his side, instantly dismissed both these men from office. Phocas, a patrician, he appointed praetorian prefect, a man of the greatest discretion and fitted by nature to be a guardian of justice. Basilius, he commanded to fill the office of quaestor, a man known among the patricians for his agreeable qualities and a notable besides. However, the insurrection continued no less violently under them. Now on the 5th day of the insurrection in the late afternoon, the Emperor Justinian gave orders to Hypatius and Pompeius, nephews of the late Emperor Anastasius, to go home as quickly as possible, either because he suspected that some plot was being matured by them against his own person, or it may be because destiny brought them to this. But they feared that the people would force them to the throne, as in fact fell out, and they said that they would be doing wrong if they should abandon their sovereign when he found himself in such danger. When the Emperor Justinian heard this, he inclined still more to his suspicion, and he bade them quit the palace instantly. Thus, then, these two men betook themselves to their homes, and, as long as it was night, they remained there quietly. But on the following day, at sunrise, it became known to the people that both men had quit the palace where they had been staying, so the whole population ran to them, and they declared Hypatius emperor and prepared to lead him to the marketplace to assume the power. But the wife of Hypatius, Mary, a discreet woman who had the greatest reputation for prudence, laid hold of her husband and would not let go, but cried out with loud lamentation and with entreaties to all her kinsmen that the people were leading him on the road to death. But since the throng overpowered her, she unwillingly released her husband, and he, by no will of his own, came to the forum of Constantine, where they summoned him to the throne. Then, since they had neither diadem nor anything else with which it is customary for a king to be clothed, they placed a golden necklace upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. By this time, the members of the Senate were assembling, as many of them as had not been left in the emperor's residence, and many expressed the opinion that they should go to the palace to fight. But Origenes, a man of the Senate, came forward and spoke as follows: "Fellow Romans, it is impossible that the situation which is upon us be solved in any way except by war. Now, war and royal power are agreed to be the greatest of all things in the world. But when action involves great issues, it refuses to be brought to a successful conclusion by the brief crisis of a moment. But this is accomplished only by wisdom of thought and energy of action, which men display for a length of time. Therefore, if we shall go out against the enemy, our cause will hang in the balance, and we shall be taking a risk which will decide everything in a brief space of time. And, as regards the consequences of such action, we shall either fall down and worship fortune or reproach her altogether. For those things whose issue is most quickly decided fall, as a rule, under the sway of fortune. But if we handle the present situation more deliberately, not even if we wish shall we be able to take Justinian in the palace, but he will very speedily be thankful if he is allowed to flee. For authority, which is ignored, always loses its power, since its strength ebbs away with each day. Moreover, we have other palaces, both Placilianae and the palace named from Helen, which this emperor should make his headquarters, and from there he should carry on the war and attend to the ordering of all other matters in the best possible way." So spoke Origenes, but the rest, as the crowd is accustomed to do, insisted more excitedly and thought that the present moment was opportune. Not least of all, Hypatius bade them lead the way to the hippodrome. But some say that he came there purposely, being well disposed toward the emperor. Now, the emperor and his court were deliberating as to whether it would be better for them if they remained or if they took to flight in the ships. And many opinions were expressed favoring either course. And the Empress Theodora also spoke to the following effect as to the belief: future would bring forth. All the hopes of the emperor were centered upon Belisarius and Mandus, of whom the former, Belisarius, had recently returned from the Persian War, bringing with him a following which was both powerful and imposing. And in particular, he had a great number of spearmen and guards who had received their training in battles and the perils of warfare. Mandus had been appointed general of the Illyrians, and by mere chance had happened to come under summons to Byzantium on some necessary errand, bringing with him Aurelian barbarians. When Hypatius reached the hippodrome, he went up immediately to where the emperor is accustomed to take his place and seated himself on the royal throne, from which the emperor was always accustomed to view the equestrian and athletic contests, and from the palace Mundus went out through the gate, which, from the circling descent, has been given the name of the snail. Belisarius, meanwhile, began at first to go straight up toward Hypatius himself and the royal throne, and when he came to the adjoining structure, where there has been a guard of soldiers from of old, he cried out to the soldiers, commanding them to open the door for him as quickly as possible, in order that he might go against the tyrant. But since the soldiers had decided to support neither side until one of them should be manifestly victorious, they pretended not to hear at all, and thus put him off. So Belisarius returned to the emperor and declared that the day was lost for them, for the soldiers who guarded the palace were rebelling against him. The emperor therefore commanded him to go to the so-called Bronze Gate and the Propylaea. There, so Belisarius, with difficulty and not without danger and great exertion, made his way over ground covered by ruins and half-burned buildings, and descended to the stadium. And when he had reached the blue colonnade, which is on the right of the emperor's throne, he purposed to go against Hypatius himself first. But since there was a small door there, which had been closed and was guarded by the soldiers of Hypatius who were inside, he feared lest, while he was struggling in the narrow space, the populace should fall upon him, and, after destroying both himself and all his followers, should proceed with less trouble and difficulty against the emperor, concluding, therefore, that he must go against the populace who had taken their stand in the hippodrome, a vast multitude crowding each other in great disorder. He drew his sword from its sheath and commanded the others to do likewise. With a shout, he advanced upon them at a run, but the populace, who were standing in a mass and not in order, at the sight of armored soldiers who had a great reputation for bravery and experience in war, and seeing that they struck out with their swords unsparingly, beat a hasty retreat. Then a great outcry arose, as was natural, and Mundus, who was standing not far away, was eager to join in the fight, for he was a daring and energetic fellow, but he was at a loss as to what he should do under the circumstances. When, however, he observed that Belisarius was in the struggle, straightway made a sally into the hippodrome through the entrance, which they call the Gate of Death. Then, indeed, from both sides, the partisans of Hypatius were assailed with might and main and destroyed. The rout had become complete, and there had already been great slaughter of the populace, Perozes and Justus, nephews of the Emperor Justinian, without anyone daring to lift a hand against them, dragged Hypatius down from the throne, and, leading him in, handed him over, together with Pompeius, to the emperor. And there perished among the populace on that day more than 30,000. But the emperor commanded the two prisoners to be kept in severe confinement. Then, while Pompeius was weeping and uttering pitiable words, for the man was wholly inexperienced in such misfortunes, Hypatius reproached him at length and said that those who were about to die unjustly should not lament. For in the beginning they had been forced by the people against their will, and afterwards they had come to the hippodrome with no thought of harming the emperor, and the soldiers killed both of them on the following day and threw their bodies into the sea. The emperor confiscated all their property for the public treasury, and also that of all the other members of the Senate who had sided with them later. However, he restored to the children of Hypatius and Pompeius, and to all others, the titles which they had formerly held, and as much of their property as he had not happened to bestow upon his friends. This was the end of the insurrection in Byzantium. Tribunanus and John were thus deprived of office, but at a later time they were both restored to the same positions. And Tribunianus lived on in office many years and died of disease, suffering no further harm from anyone, for he was a smooth fellow and agreeable in every way and well, able by the excellence of his education to throw into the shade his affliction of avarice. But John was oppressive and severe alike with all men, inflicting blows upon those whom he met and plundering without respect absolutely all their money. Consequently, in the 10th year of his office, he rightly and justly atoned for his lawless conduct in the following manner. The Empress Theodora hated him above all others, and, while he gave offense to the woman by the wrongs he committed, he was not of a mind to win her by flattery or by kindness in any way. But he openly set himself in opposition to her and kept slandering her to the emperor, neither blushing before her high station nor feeling shame because of the extraordinary love which the emperor felt for her. When the queen perceived what was being done, she purposed to slay the man, but in no way could she do this, since the Emperor Justinian set great store by him. And when John learned of the purpose of the queen regarding him, he was greatly terrified. And whenever he went into his chamber to sleep, he expected every night that some one of the barbarians would fall upon him to slay him. And he kept peeping out of the room and looking about the entrances, and remained sleepless. Although he had attached to himself many thousands of spearmen and guards, a thing which had been granted to no prefect before that time. But at daybreak, forgetting all, his fears of things divine and human, he would become again a plague to all the Romans, both in public and in private. And he conversed commonly with sorcerers, and constantly listened to profane oracles which pretended for him the imperial office, so that he was plainly walking on air and lifted up by his hopes of the royal power. But in his rascality and the lawlessness of his conduct, there was no moderation or abatement, and there was in him absolutely no regard for God. And even when he went to a sanctuary to pray and to pass the night, he did not do at all as the Christians are wont to do, but he clothed himself in a coarse garment appropriate to a priest of the old faith, which they are now accustomed to call Hellenic, and throughout that whole night mumbled out some unholy words which he had practiced, praying that the mind of the emperor might be still more under his control, and that he himself might be free from harm at the hands of all men. At this time Belisarius, after subjugating Italy, came to Byzantium at the summons of the emperor with his wife Antonina in order to march against the Persians. And while in the eyes of all others he was an honored and distinguished person, as was natural, John alone was hostile to him and worked actively against him for no other reason than that he drew the hatred of all to himself, while Belisarius enjoyed an unequal popularity to Crete, and it was on him that the hope of the Romans centered as he marched once more against the Persians, leaving his wife in Byzantium. Antonina, the wife of Belisarius, purposing to do a favor to the empress, devised the following plan. John had a daughter, Euphemia, who had a great reputation for discretion, but a very young woman, and for this reason very susceptible. This girl was exceedingly loved by her father, for she was his only child. By treating this young woman kindly for several days, Antonina succeeded most completely in winning her friendship, and she did not refuse to share her secrets with her. And on one occasion, when she was present alone with her in her room, she pretended to lament the fate which was upon her, saying that although Belisarius had made the Roman Empire broader by a goodly measure than it had been before, and though he had brought 2 captive kings and so great an amount of wealth to Byzantium, he found Justinian ungrateful, and in other respects she slandered the government as not just. No, Euphemia was overjoyed by these words, for she too was hostile to the present administration by reason of her fear of the empress, and she said, "And yet, dearest friend, it is you and Belisarius who are to blame for this, seeing that, though you have opportunity, you are not willing to use your power." And Antonina replied quickly, "It is because we are not able, my daughter, to undertake revolutions in camp, lest some of those here at home join with us in the task. Now, if your father were willing, we should most easily organize this project and accomplish whatever God wills." When Euphemia heard this, she promised eagerly that the suggestion would be carried out, and departing from there, she immediately brought the matter before her father. And he was pleased by the message, for he inferred that this undertaking offered him a way to the fulfillment of his prophecies and to the royal power. And straightway, without any hesitation, he assented, and bade his child arrange that on the following day he himself should come to confer with Antonina and give pledges. When Antonina learned the mind of John, she wished to lead him as far as possible astray from the understanding of the truth. So she said that, for the present, it was inadvisable that he should meet her, for fear lest some suspicion should arise strong enough to prevent proceedings. But she was intending straightway to depart for the east to join Belisarius. When, therefore, she had quit Byzantium and had reached the suburb, there John should come as if to salute her and to escort her forth on the journey, and they should confer regarding matters of state and give and receive their pledges. In saying this, she seemed to John to speak well, and a certain day was appointed to carry out the plan. And the empress, hearing the whole account from Antonina, expressed approval of what she had planned, and by her exhortations raised her enthusiasm to a much higher pitch still. When the appointed day was at hand, Antonina bade the empress farewell and departed from the city, and she went to Ruffinini as if to begin on the following day her journey to the east. Hitherto came John at night in order to carry out the plan which had been agreed upon. Meanwhile, the empress denounced to her husband the things which were being done by John to secure the tyranny, and she sent Narses, the eunuch, and Marcellus, the commander of the palace guards, to Rufinien, with numerous soldiers, in order that they might investigate what was going on, and, if they found John setting about a revolution, that they might kill the man forthwith and return. So these departed for this task, but they say that the emperor got information of what was being done and sent one of John's friends to him, forbidding him on any condition to meet Antonina secretly. But John, since it was fated that he should fare ill, disregarding the emperor's warning, about midnight met Antonina close by a certain wall behind which she had stationed Narses and Marcellus with their men, that they might hear what was said, while John, with unguarded tongue, was assenting to the plans for the attack and binding himself with the most dread oaths. Teas and Marcellus suddenly set upon him. But in the natural confusion which resulted, the bodyguards of John came immediately to his side, and one of them smote Marcellus with his sword, not knowing who he was, and thus John was enabled to escape with them and reach the city with all speed. And if he had had the courage to go straightway before the emperor, I believe that he would have suffered no harm at his hand. But as it was, he fled for refuge to the sanctuary and gave the empress opportunity to work her will against him at her pleasure. May 541 thus. Then, from being prefect, he became a private citizen, and rising from that sanctuary, he was conveyed to another, which is situated in the suburb of the city of Cyzicus, called by the Cyzicus Artis. There he donned the garb of a priest, much against his will, not a bishop's gown, however, but that of a presbyter, as they are called. But he was quite unwilling to perform the office of a priest, lest at some time it should be a hindrance to his entering again into office, for he was by no means ready to relinquish his hopes. All his property was immediately confiscated to the public treasury, but a large proportion of this the emperor remitted to him, for he was still inclined to spare him. There it was possible for John to live, disregarding all dangers and enjoying great wealth, both that which he himself had concealed and that which by the decision of the emperor remained with him, and to indulge in luxury at his pleasure, and, if he had reasoned wisely, to consider his present lot a happy one. For this reason all the Romans were exceedingly vexed with the man, because, forsooth, after proving himself the basest of all demons, contrary to his deserts, he was leading a life happier than before. But God, I think, did not suffer John's retribution to end thus, but prepared for him greater punishment, and it fell out thus. There was in Cyzicus a certain bishop named Eusebius, a man harsh to all who came in his way, and no less so than John. This man, the Cyzicenes, denounced to the emperor and summoned to justice. And since they accomplished nothing inasmuch as Eusebius circumvented them by his great power, certain youths agreed together and killed him in the marketplace of Cyzicus. Now, it happened that John had become especially hostile to Eusebius, and hence the suspicion of the plot fell upon him. Accordingly, men were sent from the Senate to investigate this act of pollution, and these men first confined John in a prison, and then this man, who had been such a powerful prefect and had been inscribed among the patricians and had mounted the seat of the consuls, than which nothing seems greater, at least in the Roman state. They made to stand naked like any robber or footpad, and thrashing him with many blows upon his back, compelled him to tell his past life. And while John had not been clearly convicted as guilty of the murder of Eusebius, it seemed that God's justice was exacting from him the penalties of the world. Purchase for some few obols, and wherever the ship anchored, those who had him in charge commanded him to ask from those he met bread or obols. Thus, begging everywhere along the way, he was conveyed to the city of Antioch in Egypt. And this is now the 3rd year during which they east, and, sending him to Libya, gained over the country, as will be told later on in my narrative. When this information came to Chosroes and the Persians, they were mightily vexed, they already repented, having made peace with the Romans, because they perceived that their power was extending greatly. And Chosroes sent envoys to Byzantium and said that he rejoiced with the Emperor Justinian, and he asked with them. This account goes on to say, and he fled with a great outcry, and suddenly fell among these very soldiers. Thus they laid hands upon the man, and immediately set fire to the palace and burned it, in order that there might be left no hope from there for those making revolutions. And John they led away to the prison and bound. And one of them, fearing lest the soldiers, upon learning that the tyrant survived, might again make trouble for the city, killed John, and in this way stopped the confusion. Such then was the progress of events touching this tyranny. Not long after this, Chosroes, upon learning that Belisarius had begun to win Italy also for the Emperor Justinian, was no longer able to restrain his thoughts, but he wished to discover pretexts, in order that he might break the treaty on some grounds which would seem plausible. And he conferred with Alamandarus concerning this matter, and commanded him to provide causes for war. So Alamandarus brought against Aretas the charge that he, Aretas, was doing him violence in a matter of boundary lines, and he entered into conflict with him in time of peace, and began to overrun the land of the Romans on this pretext. And he declared that, as for him, he was not breaking the treaty between the Persians and Romans, for neither one of them had included him in it, and this was true. For no mention of Saracens was ever made in treaties, on the ground that they were included under the names of Persians and Romans. Now, this country, which at that time was claimed by both tribes of Saracens, is called Strata, and extends to the south of the city of Palmyra. Nowhere does it produce a single tree or any of the useful growth of cornlands, for it is burned exceedingly dry by the sun. But from of old it has been devoted to the pasturage of some few flocks. Now Aretas maintained that the place belonged to the Romans, proving his assertion by the name which has long been applied to it by all. And he also adduced the testimonies of men of the oldest times, Alamandres, however, was by no means inclined to quarrel concerning the name, but he claimed that tribute had been given him from of old for the pasturage there by the owners of the flocks. The Emperor Justinian therefore entrusted the settlement of the disputed points to Strategius, patrician and administrator of the royal treasures, and besides, a man of wisdom and of good ancestry, and with him Sumus, who had commanded the troops in Palestine. The Sumus was the brother of Julian, who not long before had served as envoy to the Ethiopians in Omerete, and to one of them, Sumus insisted that the Romans ought not to surrender the country, but Strategius begged of the emperor that he should not do the Persians the favor of providing them with pretexts for the war which they already desired, for the sake of a small bit of land and one of absolutely no account, but altogether unproductive and unsuitable for crops. The Emperor Justinian therefore took the matter under consideration. And a long time was spent in the settlement of the question, but Chosroes, the king of the Persians, claimed that the treaty had been broken by Justinian, who had lately displayed great opposition to his house, in that he had attempted in time of peace to attach Alamandres to himself. For, as he said, Sumus, who had recently gone to the Saracen ostensibly to arrange matters, had hoodwinked him by promises of large sums of money on condition that he should join the Romans. And he brought forward a letter which he alleged the Emperor Justinian had written to Alamandres concerning these things. He also declared that he had sent a letter to some of the Huns in which he urged them to invade the land of the Persians and to do extensive damage to the country thereabout. This letter he asserted to have been put into his hands by the Huns themselves who had come before him. So then, Chosroes, with these charges against the Romans, was purposing to break off the treaty. But as to whether he was speaking the truth in these matters, I am not able to say at this point. Vitiges, the leader of the Goths, already worsted in the war, sent 2 envoys to him to persuade him to march against the Romans. But the men whom he sent were not Goths, in order that the real character of the embassy might not be at once obvious and so make negotiations useless, but Ligurian priests who were attracted to this enterprise by rich gifts of money. One of these men, who seemed to be the more worthy, undertook the embassy, assuming the pretended name of bishop, which did not belong to him at all, while the other followed as his attendant. And when, in the course of the journey, they came to the land of Thrace, they attached to themselves a man from there to be an interpreter of the Syriac and the Greek tongues, and without being detected by any of the Romans, they reached the land of Persia. For, inasmuch as they were at peace, they were not keeping a strict guard over that region. And coming before Chosroes, they spoke as follows: "It is true, O king, that all other envoys undertake their task for the sake of advantages to themselves as a rule. But we have been sent by Vitiges, the king of the Goths and the Italians, in order to speak in behalf of thy kingdom. And consider that he is now present before thee, speaking these words. If anyone should say, O king, putting all in a word, that thou hast given up thy kingdom and all men everywhere to Justinian, he would be speaking correctly. For since he is by nature a meddler and a lover of those things which in no way belong to him, and is not able to abide by the settled order of things, he has conceived the desire of seizing upon the whole earth, and has become eager to acquire for himself each and every state. Accordingly, since he was neither able alone to assail the Persians, nor with the Persians, opposing him to proceed against the others, he decided to deceive thee with the pretense of peace, and by forcing the others to subjection to acquire mighty forces against thy state. Therefore, after having already destroyed the kingdom of the Vandals and subjugated the Moors, while the Goths, because of their friendship, stood aside for him, he has come against us, bringing vast sums of money and many men. Now, it is evident that if he is able also to crush the Goths utterly, he will, with us and those already enslaved, march against the Persians, neither considering the name of friendship nor blushing before any of his sworn promises. While, therefore, some hope of safety is still left thee, do not do us any further wrong, nor suffer it thyself. But see, in our misfortunes, what will, a little later, befall the Persians. And consider that the Romans could never be well disposed to thy kingdom, and that when they become more powerful, they will not hesitate at all to display their enmity toward the Persians. Use, therefore, this good chance while the time fits, lest thou seek for it after it has ceased. For when once the time consented to be persuaded. And he did the very same thing a little later in the case of the addresses of the Armenians and of the Lazi, which will be spoken of directly. And yet they were bringing as charges against Justinian the very things which would naturally be encomiums for a worthy monarch, namely, that he was exerting himself to make his realm larger and much more splendid. For these accusations one might make also against Cyrus, the king of the Persians, and Alexander, the Macedonian. Perozes is never accustomed to dwell together with envy. For these reasons, then, Chosroes was purposing to break off the treaty. At this same time, another event also occurred. It was as follows. That Simeon, who had given Pharyngium into the hands of the Romans, persuaded the Emperor Justinian, while the war was still at its height, to present him with certain villages of Armenia, and becoming master of these places, he was plotted against and murdered by those who had formerly possessed them, After this crime had been committed, the perpetrators of the murder fled into the land of Persia. They were two brothers, sons of Tans, Perozes, and when the emperor heard this, he gave over the villages to Amasasps, the nephew of Simeon, and appointed him ruler over the Armenians. This Amasasps, as time went on, was denounced to the Emperor Justinian by one of his friends, Cassius by name, on the ground that he was abusing the Armenians and wished to give over to the Persians Theodosius and certain other fortresses. After telling this, Cassius, by the emperor's will, slew Amasasps treacherously, and himself secured the command over the Armenians by the gift of the emperor. And being base by nature, he gained the opportunity of displaying his inward character, and he proved to be the most cruel of all men toward his subjects. For he plundered their property without excuse and ordained that they should pay an unheard-of tax of 4 centenaria. But the Armenians, unable to bear him any longer, conspired together and slew Cassius and fled for refuge to Pharyngium. Therefore, the emperor sent cities against them from Byzantium. For Cities had been delaying there since the time when the treaty was made. The Armenians by persuasion and to attach them to his cause, in order that the task of overpowering the others might be attended with less difficulty and toil. And the tribe called the Especiani, great in power and in numbers, was willing to join him. And they went to Citis and begged him to give them pledges in writing that they abandoned their kinsmen in the battle and came to the Roman army, they should remain entirely free from harm, retaining their own possessions. Now, Citis was delighted and wrote to them in tablets, giving them pledges, just as they desired of him. He then sealed the writing and sent it to them. Then, confident that by their help he would be victorious in the war without fighting, he went with his whole army to a place called Inakalika, where the Armenians had their camp. But by some chance, those who carried the tablets went by another road and did not succeed at all in meeting the Especiani. Moreover, a portion of the Roman army happened upon some few of them, and, not knowing the agreement which had been made, treated them as enemies. And Citis himself caught some of their women, but they, being now possessed with anger, arrayed themselves for battle with all the rest. But since both armies were on exceedingly difficult ground, where precipices abounded, they did not fight in one place, but scattered about among the ridges and ravines. So it happened that some few of the Armenians and Citis, with not many of his followers, came close upon each other, with only a ravine lying between them. Both parties were horsemen. Then Cidas, with a few men following him, crossed the ravine and advanced against the enemy. The Armenians, after withdrawing to the rear, stopped, and Cidas pursued no further, but remained where he was. Suddenly, someone from the Roman army, an Aurelian by birth, who had been pursuing the enemy, returning impetuously from them, came up to Cidas and his men. Now, as it happened, Cidas had planted his spear in the ground. Aurelian's horse fell upon this with a great rush and shattered it. And the general was exceedingly annoyed by this, and one of the Armenians, seeing him, recognized him, and declared to all the others that it was Cidas, for it happened that he had no helmet on his head. Thus, it did not escape the enemy that he had come there with only a few men. Cidas, then, upon hearing the Armenians say this, since his spear, as has been said, lay broken in two on the ground, drew his sword and attempted immediately to recross the ravine, but the enemy advanced upon him with great eagerness, and a soldier, overtaking him in the ravine, struck him a glancing blow with his sword on the top of his head, and he took off the whole scalp, but the steel did not injure the bone at all. And Cidas continued to press forward, still more than before, but Artabanus, son of John of the Arsacidae, fell upon him from behind, and with a thrust of his spear, killed him. Thus, Cidas was removed from the world after no notable fashion, in a manner unworthy of his valor and his continual achievements against the enemy, a man who was extremely handsome in appearance and a capable warrior, and a general second to none of his contemporaries. But some say that Cidas did not die at the hand of Pompeius, Artabanus, but that Solomon, a very insignificant man among the Armenians, destroyed him. After the death of Cidas, the emperor commanded Byzantium to go against the Armenians, and he, upon drawing near, sent to them promising to effect a reconciliation between the emperor and all the Armenians, and asking that some of their notables should come to confer with him on these matters. Now, the Armenians as a whole were unable to trust Byzantium, nor were they willing to receive his proposals. But there was a certain man of the Arsacidae who was especially friendly with him, John by name, the father of Artabanus, and this man, trusting in Byzantium as his friend, came to him with his son-in-law, Byzantius, and a few others. But when these men had reached a spot where they were to meet Byzantius on the following day, and had made their bivouac there, they perceived that they had come into a place surrounded by the Roman army. Byzantius, the son-in-law, therefore earnestly entreated John to fly, and since he was not able to persuade him, he left him there alone, and in company with all the others eluded the Romans and went back again by the same road. Byzantius found John alone and slew him, and since after this the Armenians had no hope of ever reaching an agreement with the Romans, and since they were unable to prevail over the emperor in war, they came before the Persian king, led by Perozes, an energetic man, Chosroes, and the leading men among them came at that time into the presence of Chosroes, and spoke as follows: Many of us, O master, are Arsacidae, descendants of that Arsaces, who was not unrelated to the Parthian kings when the Persian realm lay under the hand of the Parthians, and who proved himself an illustrious king, inferior to none of his time. Now we have come to thee, and all of us have become slaves and fugitives, not, however, of our own will, but under most hard constraint, as it might seem by reason of the Roman power, but in truth, O king, by reason of thy decision. If, indeed, he who gives the strength to those who wish to do injustice should himself justly bear also the blame of their misdeeds. Now we shall begin our account from a little distance back in order that you may be able to follow the whole course of events. Arsaces, the last king of our ancestors, abdicated his throne willingly in favor of Theodosius, the Roman emperor, on condition that all who should belong to his family through all time should live unhampered in every respect, and in particular should in no case be subject to taxation. And we have preserved the agreement until you, the Persians, made this much vaunted treaty, which, as we think, one would not err in calling a sort of common destruction. For from that time, disregarding friend and foe, he who is in name thy friend, O king, but in fact thy enemy, has turned everything in the world upside down and wrought complete confusion. And this thou thyself shalt know at no distant time, soon as he is able to subdue completely the people of the West. For what thing which was before forbidden has he not done? Or what thing which was well established has he not disturbed? Did he not ordain for us the payment of a tax which did not exist before? And has he not enslaved our neighbors, Tani, who were autonomous? And has he not set over the king of the wretched Lazi, a Roman magistrate? An act neither in keeping with the natural order of things, nor very easy to explain in words. Has he not sent generals to the men of Bosporus, the subjects of the Huns, and attached to himself the city which in no way belongs to him? And has he not made a defensive alliance with the Ethiopian kingdoms, of which the Romans had never even heard? More than this, he has made the Homerite his possession in the Red Sea, and he is adding the palm groves to the Roman dominion. We omit to speak of the fate of the Libyans and of the Italians. The whole earth is not large enough for the man. It is too small a thing for him to conquer all the world together. But he is even looking about the heavens and is searching the retreats beyond the ocean, wishing to gain for himself some other world. Hi, therefore, O king, dost thou still delay? Akai, dost thou respect thy most accursed peace, in order forsooth that he may make thee the last morsel of all? It is thy wish to learn what kind of a man Justinian would show himself toward those who yield to him. The example is to be sought near at hand from ourselves and from the wretched lassie. And if thou wishest to see how he is accustomed to treat those who are unknown to him and who have done him not the least wrong, consider the Vandals and the Goths and the Moors. But the chief thing has not yet been spoken. Has he not made efforts in time of peace to win over by deception thy slave, Alamandras, O most mighty king, came, and to detach him from thy kingdom? And has he not striven recently to attach to himself the Huns, who are utterly unknown to him, in order to make trouble for thee? And yet an act more strange than this has not been performed in all time. For since he perceived, as I think, that the overthrow of the Western world would speedily be accomplished, he is already taken in hand to assail you of the East, since the Persian power alone has been left for him to grapple with. The peace, therefore, as far as concerns him, has already been broken for thee, and he himself has set an end to the endless peace. For they break the peace, not who may be first in arms, but they who may be caught plotting against their neighbors in time of peace. For the crime has been committed by him who attempts it, even though success be lacking. Now, as for the course which the war will follow, this is surely clear to everyone, for it is not those who furnish causes for war, but those who defend themselves against those who furnish them, who are accustomed always to conquer their enemies. Nay, more the contest will not be evenly matched for us, even in point of strength. For, as it happens, the majority of the Roman soldiers are at the end of the world. And as for the two generals, who were the best they had, we come here having slain the one, Cetus and Belisarius, will never again be seen by Justinian. For disregarding his master, he has remained in the West, holding the power of Italy himself, so that when thou goest against the enemy, no one at all will confront thee, and thou wilt have us leading the army with good will, as is natural, and with a thorough knowledge of the country. When Chosroes heard this, he was pleased, and calling together all who were of noble blood among the Persians, he disclosed to all of them what Vidicus had written and what the Armenians had said, and laid before them the question as to what should be done. Then many opinions were expressed, inclining to either side, but finally it was decided that they must open hostilities against the Romans at the beginning of spring, 539 AD, for it was the late autumn season in the 13th year of the reign of the Emperor Justinian. The Romans, however, did not suspect this, nor did they think that the Persians would ever break the so-called endless peace. Although they heard that Chosroes blamed their emperor for his successes in the West, and that he preferred against him the charges which I have lately mentioned. For 2 weeks, the Roman general, Belisarius, has been chasing the Persian army through the Armenian highlands. His men are exhausted and hungry, but their supplies are almost exhausted. It's now or never if he wants to catch the Persians before they can regroup. So Belisarius makes a decision. He will attack. What follows is one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman military history. A disaster so quiet that it's all but forgotten today. And the worst part is that the Romans aren't even defeated by an army stronger than theirs. They lose to the very people they were sent to conquer when Belisarius attacked. The Persians were spread out across a wide plain, tending to their camp and farms, completely caught off guard. But the Romans were eager for a fight after weeks on the road and a fast-approaching deadline. Their emperor, Arcadius, needed to show the people of Constantinople a victory to celebrate Easter. So, despite the exhaustion of his troops, Belisarius committed his men to the attack. His timing could not have been worse. Most of the Persian army was made up of cavalry, and those cavalrymen were the flower of the Persian military, the cream of the crop. They were battle-hardened and well-equipped. The Roman infantry, on the other hand, was exhausted, hungry, and stuck on a narrow mountain pass. As soon as the dust settled, it became clear that the Roman infantry could hold the pass against the repeated charges of the Persian cavalry. Their shields and armor were no match for the speed and ferocity of their attackers. The Romans fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. Belisarius managed to escape with a few hundred cavalry, but his army was all but destroyed. News of the defeat reached Constantinople just as the celebrations for Easter were beginning. The people were horrified. They had sent their best troops to conquer Armenia, and now they were being forced to watch their best troops get slaughtered by the very people they were meant to conquer. To watch the whole series on the conquest of Armenia and the rise of the Islamic armies, check the description below. History often celebrates the greatest victories of empires. Rome's defeat of Hannibal at Zama, the defeat of the Mongols at the Battle of Legnica, the destruction of the Aztec army by Cortes at the Battle of Tenochtitlan. But sometimes it's the quiet defeats, the ones that are all but forgotten, that teach us the most about an empire. What was the point of sending Belisarius and his men on this mission in the first place? How did such a small and elite force get so badly mauled? Why wasn't more done to secure the vital trade routes of Armenia? And above all, how does a proud and powerful empire like Rome suffer such a humiliating defeat at the hands of a supposedly weaker one like the Persians? If you found this story eye-opening, share it with someone who still thinks Rome only ever won its battles. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, should Belisarius have waited until after Easter, or was retreat never an option?